All right, hello to everyone who joined us. We'll be starting out in just a moment. We'll start out in just a moment, let everybody kind of jump in and start a discussion. Wherever you're from, thank you for joining us this fine evening / afternoon / morning. It's really a great session we have here for you today. So thank you for spending this time with us. Super excited to be doing this. We have an amazing panel of people to talk to about various developer observability topics today. So I guess I'll wait just kind of one more minute and make sure the room fills up. It's filling up nicely currently, and we'll get started. All right, welcome to everybody who has joined us today / tonight / this afternoon. I'm very excited to have you all here for our first Developer Observability Masterclass. We have an amazing panel of experts on this topic that are going to talk to you today about this amazing new phenomena and methodology that we have in practice currently in the world. My name is Tom. I'm Director of Developer Relations for a company called Lightrun. And today with me, we have quite a few interesting guests. We have Kief Morris from Thoughtworks. We have Baruch Sadogursky from JFrog. We have Barry, the author of Lean Enterprise, an entrepreneur and a business advisor, and James Governor, the co-founder of Redmonk and a chief analyst at the firm. Before we get started, a tiny bit of housekeeping agenda so we can kind of understand what's going on here today. We have a full hour, 60 minutes of session. I'm so happy you're here with us today, but I want to make sure that we just kind of keep in time to make sure we have time for everything we want to do today. We'll have about 5 minutes of this kind of housekeeping, introduction, and a poll that I'll talk about in a moment. Then we'll have 45 minutes of the actual masterclass. And then at the end, we'll have 10 minutes for Q&A. If you look right here at the bottom of your screen, there's a little Q&A button. There's a few chat bubbles you can use. If you click on it, the two chat bubbles next to the Q&A, and you write your questions there. At the end, we'll answer the questions chronologically. If you want to ask a specific panelist something, feel free to just mention, I want to ask Kief, I want to ask James, I want to ask somebody specific question. I'll make sure they direct that question to that person. A recording of this session will be sent to you after the masterclass. So feel free to kind of drop out if you need to. Please don't, but if you want, you can kind of drop out, see the recording later. One more thing regarding this little poll that I mentioned. I'm going to spin up right now a small poll, a five question multiple choice poll. Please feel free to answer it. We will be raffling 40 Lightrun t-shirts like this one. Very cool t-shirts, has a lot of like nice logos at the back and cool slogans. Sherlock Holmes team, if anybody saw us at KubeCon, at NoTLV, or one of the conferences we went to recently, you might have seen our Sherlock Holmes theme, Mysteries in Code. If you answer the poll, to whoever will answer the poll, we'll raffle out 40 Lightrun t-shirts and 10 Asubu Lightrun bottles, very cool bottles to keep your water or your drinks cold or hot. So I'm going to keep the poll open while I kind of run through the housekeeping. Please feel free to answer it, and we will raffle out those 40 t-shirts and those 10 bottles between you to anybody who answers the poll. It really helps us understand basically what your opinion about the topics that we're going to talk about is today, how you kind of came into the discussion, and potentially I'll try and kind of look at the poll answers and try and kind of pinpoint that during the discussion if we get the time and if everybody kind of answers and chimes in. We're clocking at very close to 100 people right now, which is very, very exciting. Super excited to have you here, and let's get this show on the road. Let's make a quick round of introductions before we jump in. Kief, you want to say a few words about yourself?
Yeah, my name is Kief Morris. I'm a principal consultant at Thoughtworks. I'm also heading up our community of practice on infrastructure, cloud, and that kind of stuff. Based in London, originally from the US. Glad to be here.
Awesome. Thank you, Kief. Baruch, you want to give a quick shout out to yourself?
Sure. My name is Baruch Sadogursky. I've been doing developer relations on DevOps before both terms actually existed. One of the early employees in JFrog, and brought it all the way to what it is today. Yeah, thinking, speaking, writing, doing a lot of DevOps lately.
Awesome. Thank you, Baruch. James, tell me a bit about yourself.
Hi, James Governor, co-founder of a research firm called Redmonk. We specialize in developer and engineering-led technology adoption. So we really try and understand the world through the lens of the practitioner, decisions they're making, why they're making them, and that's from a process, technology, and platform perspective.
Awesome, thank you, James. Barry, tell me a bit about yourself too.
Yeah, my name's Barry O'Reilly. I'm a co-founder of Nobody Studios, which is a venture studio trying to do 100 companies over the next 5 years. I'm also the co-author of Lean Enterprise with Jez Humble and Joanne Molesky, and yeah, also co-wrote O'Learn. So great to be here, great crew. Looking forward to sharing some great questions.
Awesome, Barry and the other panelists. Thank you very much for your time. A tiny bit about ourselves here at Lightrun. Lightrun allows you to add logs and metrics as well as capture code-level snapshots anywhere in the development lifecycle, from dev to staging and even in production, without ever stopping the live application. Lightrun also allows you to understand the code path your application takes and how it behaves when it's wrapped in feature flags, when it's delivered as part of the progressive delivery pipeline. Inside a huge monolith or distributed across multiple pods and multiple Kubernetes clusters, Lightrun just works even on-prem. But most importantly, it allows you to do everything from the comfort of your own IDE, which is a topic we're going to talk a lot about today. It's called the whole concept of shifting left. Please check out our free, lightrun.com/free, our free tier. We have plugins for IntelliJ, PyCharm, and VS Code, enabling you to do all this good stuff right from your IDE, lightrun.com/free. Let's get this show on the road. So we're going to ask questions, and then I'm going to direct the questions at specific panelists. I hope to get through all the lists of questions that we have. Again, I'd like to remind you, please make sure to introduce yourself in the chat. Tell us who you are, where you're from, what you're doing, and ask any type of question that you'd like inside the Q&A section. I'll get to it at the final point of the masterclass. Ask anything. I'll try to reach everything that I can. All right, let's get to it. So first of all, let's talk a little bit about demystifying this whole concept of debugging in production. So no company ever admits to this, but actually we all know that something, when systems crash in production, we know they did something to identify the problem and then something to fix it. At Lightrun, we're always on the phone with customers who share their production horror stories with us as they unfold. And we know a lot of people do a lot of shenanigans in production, even Fortune 500 companies. So these shenanigans range from rewriting code directly on the server, editing raw configuration files, or God forbid, modifying registry keys on Microsoft Windows servers. Tell us a little bit about the horror stories that you heard from customers, consultants in your own companies and so forth. Kind of tell us the tale of how it really happens in production, in real life, in enterprise software companies. Kief, why don't you take the first one?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think a lot of what we get is where, people are, there's a real disconnect, I think, between the people who are responsible for production and have access to production versus, the people who are writing code and having to troubleshoot. So I was working with one organization where we were basically, we're deploying to an OpenShift cluster, and this is an early kind of implementation of OpenShift. And so being a financial services organization, everything was divided up. So basically, we could deploy our application, we push, and then we wait to see what happens. When it failed, we just get an obscure error message. So we track down the people responsible for OpenShift, and we ask them, what's going on? And they say, well, it's in the server logs in the operating system, but the operating system is, the Linux team owns that, and we don't have access to actually see the logs on the server. And so, it obviously makes for a very long loop of trying to figure out what's going on, much less trying to debug it and fix it.
Gotcha. Thank you, Kief. Barry, you want to tell us a little bit about war stories from production?
Yeah, well, it ranges, right? Like I think Kief's example from working in large scale enterprises, right? It's always siloed. Sometimes in the startups when I'm working with them, it's almost chaos, right? Like people will happily jump on to live production systems, debug them, make changes and deploy code directly to production, right? It's, I think it goes to sort of risk profiles, right? I think, also, the reality is that people are going to touch production and people want to be able to see production. And I think really a lot of this is about accepting that and really can we build tools to make it safe where people can either see the information that they want to see, like as in Kief's example there, or if people are making changes, it's in a controlled way. So when they invariably make mistakes, there's ways that they can recover gracefully. So I think they're the kind of things that constantly pop up in my mind.
Awesome, thank you, Barry. Baruch, a little bit of a tales from the Java and web sphere.
Yeah. So I have stories from way when I was a Java consultant, and but yeah, it's everybody. No one wants to admit it, but everybody does it. And I saw a lot of horror stories about patching production systems by just hacking into jar files and replacing classes over there and just throwing them into whatever WebLogic JBoss back in the day. I still get the goosebumps when I think about it. It's so wrong on so many levels and so horrifying. But hey, and you know what? It is running production, huge banks, financial systems, insurance companies, and that was the official way of patching systems in production. And obviously those jar files, they were emailed to you. Obviously no versions, because the jar file has to have the exact same name. And inside it was non-readable bytecode. So there are 2 jar files, similar names, some classes inside. You need to guess which one of them kind of is a problematic one and which is a good one, and just SSH into a production system of like a large bank and just throw a jar file there and hope that you did the right thing.
So you might not see it because your screen might be kind of blocked by the speaker, but Kief is very knowingly nodding in the background to whatever.
I enjoyed James' facial expression. James was like, oh!
I feel like Baruch is describing, I don't know why you were watching me when I was doing this stuff back in the day. But also, and then you have the thing of like, and then you're going to make a change to the code and rebuild it. And like you've made changes to that jar file in production and like, oh, how do you, yeah.
Oh, obviously. I mean, it didn't pass through any process. It's just, it was in the middle of accident. One of the developers built this code on their machine, just like running it, I don't know, like compiling it in IDE, and send this jar file in an email to everybody. Hey, I have a fix. Can someone please deploy it? And the deployment was SSH replace the jar file.
I mean, to me, the fact that you've got banks that are effectively doing, what happens if you're somebody, your modem breaks, you call up customer service and they're like, have you tried turning it off and on again? I mean, you've got production systems, you realize there's a problem with the messaging servers, and investment bank says, well, maybe if we can turn them all off at the same time and turn them on again, it will work. Needless to say, galloping herds, it didn't work. But yeah, no, it's amazing what people do to production systems. But everyone's had failures. I mean, it doesn't matter what industry. It really doesn't matter. Banking, telco. Look at Cloudflare outage. Half the internet goes down. Very often a config change. Amazon byword for reliability, but obviously US East 1. They had, I think, in the space of 2 months, 3 significant system failures. So it's. I think the key for me there, when you talk about that people don't want to talk about it, I think one of the good things that we've got as an industry now is talking about failure so that we can all get a bit better, whether it's conferences like FailConf, talks where people admit, these sorts of examples. It's tremendously helpful, I think, in taking the state of the art forward.
I think that the people are ashamed of talking about it. It's a silver lining, right? I mean, they know that it's wrong. So we have at least that.
Right. And sorry, guys, but we do have to kind of move on. So thank you for all those war stories. It's really interesting. And I want to move on to the next question. Generally speaking, when you talked a lot about kind of touching production, you talk about what happens when an organization is required to touch production in order to fix something. How do you create a culture in which developers aren't simply comfortable with touching production, but in fact do it on a constant basis to work faster and more efficiently? And James, I think you can lead the charge on this one.
In terms of the culture?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, we're basically in an environment where the culture is probably the most important thing. And you do need to set a culture of, I mean, that's what observability is about. Observability is really about the developer understanding how the system performs in production. So it's about giving them the tools so that they can do that, but then also having a sense of, we talk about psychological safety. We talk about, a blameless culture, that stuff is going to break. So get to know it really well. So when it does break, you're able to fix it. And I think that is it's about, I talked about the banking example before, the galloping herds, the messaging service. That was a real example. What happened on Monday? Someone comes in and they were literally fired. There had to be sort of a gift to the gods, a sacrificial lamb because of that failure. That organization, is never really going to get better at modern distributed systems. Is never going to get better at building applications because it's not creating an environment of trust. So I think have the right tools, and a culture where you're not going to get blamed if something does go wrong, and frankly something will go wrong.
This is where all this, hey, I fixed something, try it now, comes from, right? People are afraid to say, hey, I was wrong, and now that was the problem, and this is the solution, and we can all learn from that. Instead, this shame of, oh, I did something terrible, I'm going to get fired, I'd better fix it quick and won't tell anybody what I did. This is where it comes from.
That's right. Kief, do you want to give your take on this?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what James and Baruch said. I think it's just so important that the people's natural reaction to having made a mistake or potentially broken something, whatever, has to be, I'm going to get help with that, right? And that's a normal thing to do, an acceptable thing to do, and that should be celebrated, right? So I've certainly seen situations where somebody did something and then tried to cover their tracks. I think I'm remembering an incident where somebody checked in an AWS key into a Git repository, which of course then got snaffled up very, very quickly. And they tried to cover their tracks and it didn't help. and obviously, that, I mean, it's got to be the focus, like, something's gone wrong. Great. Let's get into it. Let's fix it. And also just the habits and getting used to it, right? The habits of, like, we working across production and development environments, testing environments, we have to work across those the same ways, and just getting used to it being a routine that we know how to handle and we're comfortable with.
Speaking of kind of not checking keys into Git, which is usually not a good idea, but the whole notion of shifting left infrastructure as code and so forth, doesn't it kind of building your infrastructure in the same way that you build your application, doesn't that kind of push you in the correct direction? I think Kief and Baruch probably would have a lot to say about that topic, kind of this culture of building everything in the same fashion. You build your infrastructure, you build your security, you build your testing, you build your application, everything is built and codified in the same way, right? That really helps this culture of like a constant iteration culture, right?
I think it's the skills as well. So it's basically like, if you want to be ready to handle a production incident, you need to be sure that the way that you do that is the same way that you handle during development, right? So as you develop, you write some code, you push it, run tests, you deploy it, it breaks in the dev environment. Basically, whatever you do there should be the same stuff that you do in prod. So rather than doing the thing which a lot of organizations do, which would say, we're going to give people root access to dev, and you're going to have a lot of kind of things at your disposal there. I like to lock it down, right? So I like to say, there was a thing on Twitter a while back where we're talking about what's a wrong definition of DevOps and SRE, and the wrong definition of DevOps is all the devs get root access to production, whereas SRE is the sysadmins get commit access to your Git repo. But like that whole thing of like root access to production is like, who should have root access to production? Ideally, nobody should, other than for a kind of a break glass kind of thing. But also in dev, nobody should have root access, right? So whatever tools you have, and this obviously goes to the observability thing as well. So whatever tools you have at your disposal in production for debugging should be in your dev environments, and you should be using those as a matter of course in development, so that when something does go wrong in production, I'm just doing the same thing I did yesterday when I pushed a change and broke dev. We got something wrong in prod, so I'll fix it in the same way with the same tools and the same access.
Yeah, that consistency is so important.
But it's fascinating how you invert it, right? Because as you mentioned, most of the time you say, hey, developers obviously should have access to development because it's a development environment. There is no reason to constrain them. And when we want to make this consistency, all right, makes sense. Let's do the same to prod. And this is like, hey, freedom and responsibility, everybody have access to prod, good luck, and we do this consistency. What you say is, let's do this consistency the other way around. And if you don't have access to prod, don't have access to dev, and now do in the same way. But the question is, what will be the reaction of the developers? Right? Can they say, well, that makes sense, and we will fight as we trained, so we need to train in a restrained environment, or they will say, hey, you know what, this is outrageous. This is my environment. I want to have full access. There is no reason for you to restrain it.
Yeah. I mean,
Barry, we haven't heard from you in a bit. Sorry, Kief, for stopping you. We haven't heard from you in a bit, Barry.
No, it's always interesting, right? Like when the debate here about talking about when you give people rights to certain machines and what they can do on them, right? Like what's the better path, right? I always felt like you needed to bring the pain forward, right? And like to the example of like trying to have your dev environment as close to your pre-production and production environments, so you feel the pain of working in that environment every day. And you're going to innovate, you're going to make better tools, you're going to actually start to deploy, I think, some of these better habits and culture from the beginning, where I think if you have a place where you can do what you want and play how you want, people will take liberties, right? There's no boundaries or feedback mechanisms that tell them the changes that they're making in a local environment is different from where they are going to deploy their code ultimately. So it's a really interesting culture question as well about what standard do you set as a development organization and what boundaries and rules will you adhere to. So yeah, it's really fascinating to hear like what's the right answer. I don't know. It's going to be different for everybody, but I think you have to have they have to be clear on what those boundaries are.
Yeah, I think, guardrails and constraints. I mean, I use the word consistency in terms of what Kief was saying, but I think that's one of the big questions, Barry, at the moment. We've had this build out of well, I mean, obviously we've got the legacy estate, we've got this build out of modern distributed systems. And there's been too much root access. There's been too much freedom. You've got a sort of multi-trillion-dollar trading company, and they're like, we're going to rebuild our whole platform, and we're going to give everyone root access, and we'll worry about security after the fact. And you say, so who's got banking and compliance expertise on the team? And they're like, no one. They're all web people, and we'll worry about that later. And again, this is a real example. So I think that as an industry at the moment, we are thinking about, platform engineering. What are the constraints? What are the guardrails and standards, and how do we do that? Because certainly, I think there has been a view, and Redmonk is a bit guilty of this. The new kingmakers, developers, let your engineers be very much involved in the decision-making process. But that doesn't mean that everyone has freedom. I mean, if you look at the most successful firms out there, there are standards in language choices, infrastructure choices, and so on. And you have to lock the environment down in order to make your developers more productive, I think.
You could also do that and still give the ability to that you need to kind of deal with things. So there's a question, I think Robert in chat was talking about what happens when your centralized infrastructure team doesn't have the capacity to support you, right? Well, ideally you have that kind of self-service ability to make changes to infrastructure, but in a way that's controlled. So my idea, infrastructure as code is one of my favorite things, right? So ideally, developers should be able to make changes to infrastructure code and push it into their dev environment to make the fixes there. And then you have the guardrails in terms of pipelines and things to make sure that change will go consistently into production, but only if it meets the criteria, passes tests, or whatever you may have, so that you have kind of the ability to address things without the kind of unconstrained freedom, if you see what I mean.
And to Robert's question, it is. Sorry, we've got Tom. Well, I'll stop responding to all of this. But
no worries, it's fine. The discussion is good.
One of the things that will happen is if your infrastructure team can't support you, that's a significant problem. I mean, at that point, you're like, what platform are you using? And a developer and a development team, that's where they'll start to use cloud services where the service is managed, because you can't have that disconnect. That then you're going to end up with a blame game. Then you're going to end up with the significant problems. So I think, it sounds to me as if there's a little bit of a platform, some platform decision making to be done there, and the automation needs to be sufficient that they can serve you better.
Yeah. And just one before we probably
Sure.
hand the reins back to you, Tom. It's
No
run
worries.
wild.
Yeah, we just hijacked the whole thing. Sorry about it, Tom.
No worries.
I think one of the other advantages of what we were talking about earlier of that shifting left and the constraints on dev, and we were talking about like the devs might not like that, right? I need to have access and to control to what I do in the development environment. Well, if it's hard, if those constraints make it difficult to debug and fix things in your dev environment because they're too constrained, well, that gives you the incentive. Okay, we need to improve that, right? So that it's also then easy to do it in prod.
So I think that this kind of is it's actually good that you went on this tangent, because it's a great jumping off point to the next question, which is really about kind of the change that we're looking at as industry. You talked about infrastructure as code. I talked about the differing nature of pushing kind of versioning your infrastructure. So when monoliths kind of went out of fashion and microservices became all the rage, cloud became the gold standard and so forth, we lost a very important aspect of observability. A single system in which our entire stack ran, a big behemoth of a machine sitting on a rack somewhere that you can look into, get rid into, access, and do whatever you want to it. So now each problem is not only difficult in and of itself, but is naturally distributed systems problem. This really wasn't the case a mere decade or two ago. So DevOps was the forefront of this change, and kind of habits in the DevOps methodology and genre became standard practice, and DevOps engineers became standards in many companies. And the methodology of operating software, operating infrastructure evolved accordingly with the changes. We got tooling to accommodate this change. Application developers were kind of left behind in that sense, because they didn't kind of get the same value that operators did. So how do we match the developer experience, the application developer experience, who's still deploying their software to production on those, multiple production Kubernetes clusters and multiple clouds and serverless functions, what have you, more buzzwords that I can throw in here. How do we match the developer experience to the operator experience? And Kief, I think coming from Thoughtworks, that's kind of exactly your area of expertise.
Yeah, I think it's a tricky one, right? Because on the one hand, developers just want to code, write the code, focus on building the features and functionality that they need, and getting that through, and they don't want to have to muck around with stuff. So as an example of like going to the cloud to kind of get away from your constraining infrastructure folks, and then finding that you've got to kind of wire together like roots and IAM roles and all this kind of really low level nasty stuff that that often isn't helpful, right? So you kind of have to because developers also then don't want to be constrained when you need to do that, right? So on the one hand, you don't want to have to mess with that stuff. On the other hand, you don't want to be constrained and be confronted, as a lot of organizations do when they create a platform, is to create something that ties your hands and says, well, you can't do the things that you need to do. You're going to have to just suffer. And so I really think it's about getting the kind of abstractions right, but also not using abstraction layers and platforms as a constraint to say you're blocked from doing things. We're giving you a black box, but more as a kind of way of managing the cognitive load and the focus of what you're working on right now. So I don't want to have to. I want to write my code, push it, and if it fails, then I want to be able to switch into the mode of working with the lower levels where I need to. And I think that's a really difficult challenge with the whole developer experience thing.
So basically what you're saying is that if I have a few different abstractions, as an application developer, if I have a few different abstractions on my layer, I want to move between them only when I need to move between them, and have everything else kind of abstracted away from me while I'm working in a specific problem domain. And potentially, if possible, have it in a way that's accessible to me as an application developer, right? So I can work in the context where I want to work, right?
Yeah, and still being able to go through, again, you need the guardrails and stuff, right? So it's not about pushing that stuff straight to production. It's about, okay, I can make changes to the things in there, but there are, the checks and tests and whatever, so that it's done in the, in the right way rather than just being chaos.
Now, I know that Baruch would want to answer this question, but we don't have a lot of time, so I'm going to not let you answer this one. I'm going to let you answer the next one, okay? Okay. So James Governor from Redmonk, who's on this talk, once told me that logs are a love letter to your future self. I love this sentence. And with good instrumentation, you can still be in love with the system every single day. Now, what's the best way to avoid this skew or this gap or this kind of differentiation between the logic you write, the actual application code that does the work, and the instrumentation code? And to put it in kind of different terms, how can we make sure our logs and metrics keep up with the pace of our code changes? And James, it's natural that you will take this question. You are muted though, so it's probably best to unmute.
Yeah, maybe someone else will jump in, but yeah. I think it's about taking responsibility. I said, what's the nature of observability? Part of it is that taking responsibility for the systems that you build. So you think about how they're going to be managed. So you're building the system and you're really thinking about, the log letter for your future self, love letter for your future self, which are the logs, or also, could be, frankly, a letter to someone else, because someone is going to experience an issue with that production system. So that's great. We should absolutely be thinking about how we're going to manage this. What will be the likely metrics that we're using? If we're building a distributed system, think about, okay, what are the trace implications? But things will break, even if you can do as much testing as you want. Systems will still break, and then you're in a situation where there will be unknowns. And I think the point there is, because we're constantly making adjustments to systems, we are going to identify, frankly, that the telemetry needs to change. And yes, that is really hard to do. We're in an environment now where we're expecting the application to change all the time, but we're not necessarily finding it easy for the instrumentation and telemetry to change all the time. And so I get, not to put too fine a point on it, I'm sure Lightrun has an opinion about how that could be made easier. But I do think it's about we are going to have to update the telemetry. That can't be static any more than the application or system is.
Right. Kief, I do know, sorry for stopping you there again. Kief, I do know you had something to say about that topic too.
Yeah, I mean, we were talking about this earlier, and to me, it's very similar to test-driven development and that kind of thing, in that they really need to be together, right? As you're developing code, you need to be thinking about, well, what do I need to know about this, as it runs or as I'm trying to troubleshoot it. So it can't really be something that is done later, and it's also something that's both in the process, as in I'm going to write code and then maybe somebody's going to go in and add instrumentation later, but also just in terms of it's very difficult, I think, to instrument code and put in logging and all those kind of things afterwards to an existing code base, as it's very difficult to do that with writing tests. Whenever, if you've ever gone and take an existing code base and saying, oh, I'm going to go and add some unit tests to this, you end up having to rewrite it and restructure it just to make that work.
So it's actually a very interesting point you raise about the testing. Generally, everything you have to do post haste after the process. And this kind of it's actually very good that we kind of go on tangents here, because it's great jumping points to the next topic in line, which is kind of this shift left approach. So basically, you said there are things that you don't want to do post process, like you don't want to add tests, add instrumentation, and so forth after the fact. You want to do it while you're developing as much as possible. And to do that, application developers needs to go. Yes, Barry, nobody goes back to write unit tests. That's absolutely correct. Speaking of kind of putting the power back in developers' hands and kind of letting them do it during development and not after the fact, there's a book called Topologies by this guy, Matthew Skelton, and he suggests that each service must be fully owned by a team with sufficient cognitive capacity across the team to build and operate it. And to put it in other words, that means that the operability of the system is in direct correlation with the cognitive load it requires to build and maintain it. So coming back to the culture questions, how do you build teams that understand all the nuances of a modern production systems without any silos? And I think, Barry, you would be an excellent fit to answer that question.
Yeah, so Team Topologies, by the way, is a fantastic book by Matthew Skelton and Manuel Pau, and but its notion goes back to even further, right? One of our colleagues at ThoughtWorks, James Lewis, had this notion of microservices, right? And the notion was that no class should ever be technically bigger than James' head. Now, James has a big head; it's probably about this big if you have it on a screen, but like that became this notion of having small classes, right? Small bite sizes, bits of information that people could hold in their head. And systems, you never wanted to get them so big that one person couldn't hold them in their head. And the nature of technology means things have got more complicated. We have cross-functional teams. I think most people feel like more effective teams are anywhere between 6 to 10 people, right? Where you have cross-functional representation from designers to product leaders to engineers and ops folks, because they're holding the whole system in their heads, right? And I actually, I believe that smaller teams tend to outperform larger teams. Now we try to grow our teams to match the size of the applications, but I actually think it's better to have smaller teams. You think like Apple Pay has 15 people that run that thing, and it supports the whole planet in terms of what it's doing. So these things are important, that we recognize the complexity is part of the fact of what systems we're building now. No one person will be able to hold it in their head, but having cross-functional teams where they can keep the context alive within the team. And then the instrumentation to tell you when you're going off track, right? When things that you're not expecting or anomalies are happening, that you can respond to those unexpected instances. I think that's more the world we're in, where one engineer or one senior dev knows every single piece of line of code and how to fix something. Those days are long gone. And I think that's more where we need to be thinking about, to the point before about telemetry and feedback mechanisms. Are much more important now to help you understand when you're off where you expect to be and then respond.
So speaking of feedback mechanism, James, you probably have an opinion about tooling here, right?
One of the things about cognitive overheads is thinking about collaboration. That's what we're doing here. I mean, software delivery it's a team sport, and if we look at these, I think one of the interesting things about Matthew's work, the team topologies, is it almost takes more. It's not like a software factory. It's like a software forest. It's like an ecosystem. It's like a rainforest, and you've got lots of different kinds of creatures working together in effect, within the ecosystem. And I think there it's what are those communication mechanisms between them? And so there are specialisms. I mean, I think we've got, in this industry, when people talk about full stack developers or, T-shaped people, but the fact is, whatever happens, we're going to have specialisms. And there, I think, documenting what we do as we go along, so that the team and that we can onboard new people, so important. But I think the collaboration tooling, extremely important. Now, obviously, part of that will be something like Slack. But anyone that's ever tried to find anything in Slack, when something is hitting the fan, that may not be the ideal platform. But collaboration tools, and thinking about how we're documenting things, what we're doing with the documentation in our repos. I think what Kief was saying about what are we doing when we write software? We really should be thinking about documentation up front, tests up front. How we're going to instrument it up front. But I think the collaboration, so critical in these modern teams.
Kief, there's this concept of domain modeling, like basically different domain areas that each person incorporates. And again, coming from your background in Thoughtworks, if you don't mind sharing kind of how you see this cross-functional work across domains happen.
Yeah, but I think building on what Barry and James were saying, it's basically when you think about how to what we're all saying about breaking things down into smaller pieces so you can have a small team own a section. I think a traditional way that people have thought about doing that is more by function and saying, okay, we're going to have our infrastructure people, we're going to have our people writing tests, we're going to have people doing whatever, breaking it down that way. But then those become very, very broad and also very disjointed. So instead, doing that kind of domain-driven design kind of thing where you think about what are the areas of the system from a functional and product point of view. So we're going to have account management or order processing or what have you, and saying we're going to build teams around that who know how to do the different things in the domain. But the focus is the thing that we're building, and so that we can make sure that we're testing it properly and doing all those things. And then when you do need to kind of share, maybe you have those kind of expertise where we can't have like a deep networking expert in every single team if we've got, a dozen or more teams, each of that kind of 8 to 10 people size. So you do have to kind of provide some centralized expertise, but that can be done going back to the team topologies. That can be done by having people who embed with teams, rotate around, act in that more kind of consultant-y kind of role into the teams where it needs to be, or the providing the things as a service. And so I think, and in terms of domain-driven design and that kind of thing, I think it's really, as you get into the platforms, I think it's really useful to think about that in terms of platform domains, technology domains. You think about things like identity, think about things like storage, you think about compute and so on as being like domains where you're providing services to other teams or providing the ability for other teams to serve themselves, really. So bringing that lens into it, I think helps, because what I see often happening is people start building platforms, they become very monolithic. I've actually seen organizations where we had, like, say, 12 teams building the applications and products, and that was very, like, small teams, microservices, all very broken down, and then one team building the infrastructure, and it's all a big tangled ball of mud of infrastructure where you can't change anything because everything's gonna collapse in a heap. So that was a revelation to me of saying, we've been talking about this for applications, and now I'm seeing it for infrastructure. Interesting, it really is infrastructure as code.
So this is actually very interesting because you mentioned the concept of kind of platform thinking, or like a developer platform, which again is something Thoughtworks is kind of, has been saying for many years now. We believe at Lightrun that you should basically kind of incrementally build the pillars of your tech observability stack. So if I'm looking back at kind of Thoughtworks discipline of platform thinking, it says generally that you should think about developers as your customers. In that way, you're going to create the necessary empathy to properly consider and implement their feedback while you're building the platform. Now, how should we generally, and how do we incrementally shift developers' thinking to revolve around building observable systems? And seriously, what can we do to help? Like, how can we make sure this tangled mess of whatever it is people throw in the mix becomes untangled? Whoever wants to take the question, I'm open. So I'll direct the question then directly. Barry, if you don't mind answering first.
Yeah, well, I think, one of the ways I think about platform thinking is developers essentially have internal customers, right? It's about the customers of your platform. So are you building a platform that other developers see as valuable, has utility, and provides value to them, right? There's no one quicker. If you're not building good tools to support developers, developers will just go on the internet, do a search for Google, and find out a tool that roughly fits the job they're looking for, download it and install it, right?
Outside of the platform.
Of course, yeah. But I think
they'll do what they need to do.
That's but I always think that, like, it's a gift to have customers who will give you raw feedback and high quality feedback, and building platforms for developers, you're going to get great feedback, right? Because you can find out very quickly whether your APIs are being used, if how effective they are, how fast they are, how slow they are, how accurate they are, right? Like that's a really great feedback mechanism that you can have really fast. So that's always been inspiring for me. I don't know, Branch,
yes,
what do you? You're a DevOps.
Sorry,
You're living in the DevOps and Dev world. What do you see drives developers to want to have high utility of platforms?
Who was the question directed to, Barry?
To Branch, yeah.
Baruch.
Baruch, sorry, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, so I wanted to mention, for all our discussion about microservices, something that from my perspective, the complexity didn't go away, because it cannot go away. The systems are complex. And what we're trying to do is shift it to the place when it will be easily more like where managing it will become a little bit easier. And I think the whole migration all the way from monoliths to microservices is trying to do exactly that. And I would say with mixed results, right? A lot of use cases that we see are that we came from this complexity in the code into the same level of unmanaged complexity in the platform, in the infrastructure. No one knows how the thing should be deployed. No one knows what are the true dependencies. No one knows which dependencies are critical. But and in the end of the day, if to change one microservice, you have to redeploy the entire thing, you didn't really do microservices, right? You just did a monolith with hard-coded network interfaces between components instead of in-memory interfaces between components and code. And but yeah, like what Kief said, distributed monolith, that's exactly that. And now we see all the way back, well, that is even more terrible than we used to have in code. Let's go all the way to monolith and keep doing that instead. And I love this process because in this going back and forth, this is us searching the better way, right? It's a little bit like what we had with Agile when we went all the way to like very structured Agile methodologies, and then discovered that, yeah, that actually adds overhead instead of solving problems. And then we went all the way back, and then we kind of settled somewhere in the middle. I think what we see now is the same process. We try to find where on this range managing complexity becomes easier, right? And this is exactly the idea. And back to the question of, okay, how can we solve it? Interestingly enough, what it looks like that the easiest way to manage the complexity is in the interactive culture between people and not in any kind of technology. Because as humans, we already know how to adapt to complicated and complex interactions between people. And this is what we try to do when we shift it and we say, okay, we have those teams that manage different components, and then the interaction between the teams is where we tackle the complexity. I think it's just fascinating.
Kief or James, you want to take another shot at this question? Kief?
I was just going to make a random kind of launch off of that. So when we talk about the interaction between complex systems, if you look at the most complex computing system there is, it's the internet, right? And if you remember back in the days, those of us who are old enough, when it was still unclear what was going to become the dominant online experience. Was it going to be CompuServe? Was it going to be the old kind of AOL? The thing that won out was the internet, and because the internet wasn't about going and saying, we're going to provide a single solution or a centralized solution to all the things. It was saying, I'm going to define the rules for things to interact, and how do we do that, and ways to kind of even evolve standards, IETF, documents and those kind of things. And that won. So I think there's lessons to be learned from that.
Yeah, I just think on the platform side, for me, I'm a bit of a skeptic in the language of customer centricity. I mean, like as when the government talks about they're going to provide, we have to provide better customer service, and I'm like, I'm a citizen, I'm not a customer. The relationship is not quite the same. And or healthcare. I mean, healthcare shouldn't really be sort of fully about customer service. I want to get the right care, not the care that I think is the right care. And we think the customer is always right. I mean, the customer, I don't know, the developer is not always right. The citizen is not always right. So I do think that we are about collaborating and working together. And there I'm absolutely with Barry in terms of, so let's find better ways of working together. But I'm a little, as I say, a bit worried about thinking about the teams as customers. Really, we want a platform that implements some constraints. I mean, one of the things I talk about is that, the platform, the industry is just, the history of the industry is, at least the last 20 years of it, or 17 years of it, whatever it is like people endlessly remaking remakes of Heroku. We want an opinionated platform that instantiates a set of values that allows developers to be more productive and in flow. Now, some of them might be a bit grumpy about it, but I think it's those constraints that actually lead to more productivity. And so I'm not sure the relationship really there is a customer relationship that when it comes to yeah, we do need to serve our developers. We do need to cherish them. We do need to make them effective. But sometimes that means saying, actually, no, we have to do it this way. I think that's why, for example, people are looking at Spotify Backstage at the moment. We're seeing enterprises saying, hang on a minute, can we just have a place so that when the developer goes there at the beginning of the day, if they want to kick off a pipeline, or if they want to, get a bunch of VMs or Kubernetes, provision of Kubernetes cluster, there's a standard way of doing it. So I think that yeah, that's my only concern in thinking about devs as customers.
So if I can, I think I like the direction of kind of platform thinking and creating the best developer platforms for kind of not your customers, but your developers in-house. But this entire masterclass is about shifting left observability specifically. So I'm going to shift back that topic, if you don't mind me, right? Because we kind of went on a tangent. And to me, shifting left is mostly about kind of introducing new technologies in a familiar setting. So to me, as an application developer, the familiar setting is the ID. And developers generally want to be in three places: the code editor, GitHub, and Slack for sharing GIFs. Now, this is obviously an oversimplification, but it does illuminate kind of an important fact, which is you should meet
developers. Not an oversimplification, Tom. That is straight facts, my friend.
Exactly. It is absolutely correct. These are the only three places.
No, I disagree. It's oversimplification. You forgot the cafeteria to get the coffee.
Yes, of course. Yes. So coffee, GitHub, code editor, and Slack for sharing GIFs. Now we have all the tenets of being a software developer. No, but in all seriousness though, meeting developers where they are is meeting them in the ID or in kind of the common tools that they use during the work life. So what's your opinion of this whole shift left approach as a whole? Taking everything, infrastructure as code, observability as code, testing as code, security as code, and specifically, I'd like to get your opinion on augmenting this kind of old and familiar tool called the IDE with new capabilities. Let's start with Kief, and then we'll do Baruch, because we haven't had for Baruch in there.
Okay, I mean, I think, to me, it's about, shifting left is about putting, so there's two things: there's responsibility and then the power to kind of meet that responsibility into the hands of developers. So just as an example, go back to testing. I remember on a project that Barry and I worked on when he was in ThoughtWorks, where we got in a separate person to do performance testing, or the client had brought in a separate person to do performance testing. And of course, they were using a very expensive commercial performance testing tool. And that created this real long loop where they would run the tests and they would come back and say, well, it's slow here. And the developers would be like, okay, how do I fix that? Like, I can make some guesses by like making some changes, then pushing it and seeing what happens the next time the performance tester runs his tool. Whereas what we really want to do is put the tools into the hand of the developer to say, I can run the performance tests and I can find out right away the feedback loop. If I write the code, does it help with the performance or not? And then I think it's a natural thing, and I'll make the plug for you guys, Tom, and say you want to have the visibility of like the the metrics and stuff around it when you're doing that kind of thing. And so I want to be able to see, like, as I write my code and push it into an environment, tests are running, performance tests are running. When they fail, I want to see, okay, it failed here, and this is what was going on in terms of the code, like whatever the metrics were, at that point. I want to have visibility of that all in one place so that I can then have that really, really fast feedback loop. And to me, that's the essence of the shift left.
Right. It's basically about putting the tools in the developer's hands and figuring out whether something, what's going on with something, right, when it's in production, right? That's basically your essence here.
Yeah, it's a responsibility. Again, if you can say developers should have the responsibility for like things like security, right? Rather than it being somebody else or performance or whatever. Developers should have responsibility for that, but that means you have to give them the tools to be able to own that responsibility.
Right. So Baruch, your opinion on this?
Yeah. So we obviously in JFrog, we do have now access to ops-oriented tools, if you wish, inside the IDE for developers to see. And my personal story, I was a little bit skeptical when we started on this journey, because thinking about mental capacity and thinking about developers care about code, I would say, you know what, you look at a tool like JFrog Artifactory, the developers really couldn't care less, right? Because they have dependencies come from somewhere, they deploy their code to their pipeline, and they're done. There is nothing for them to actually see and interact in IDE, so why do we ever need a plugin? And boy, how wrong I was. It turns out that when we do this shift left and we provide those tools for developers, suddenly the developers can make smarter decisions about their code, which obviously, in the end of the day, makes everything better. My thinking was, hey, you know what? If they want to check something and they want to choose one dependency on top of the other, here we have an interface. It's in the browser. Their browser is open. They will go there and figure it out. It's not a rocket science. But from what we saw, and we made an experiments, obviously, and measured the impact is amazing, just because the same mental thing of shift left and actually bringing the tools that might be advisory, might not be critical, but still important advisory for improving the code, the developers, right? And that was a lesson for me. I was obviously super excited to get wrong about this one. And yeah, it's a big deal. You think about tools that are originated in ops, and suddenly you bring them to dev, and they are DevOps tools, because people suddenly care about that, regardless of which side of the house they reside. And this is pretty amazing.
James, your take on?
I wanted to go on mute because it wasn't, and then I get it. I mean, come on, what kind of flow is this? What a bad person I am. Yeah, I mean, I think that for me, there is an aspect, and there's a comment in the chat from Michael, you know, whether developers should be responsible. I think I've said this already, making the right thing the easy thing. Like, humans are extremely lazy in essence, and convenience wins every time. So if we think about developer experience, and I think this is where it gets to this sort of question about, you know, the IDE or anything else. Context shifting is a pain. It's a cognitive overhead. We want to be able to, we want things to just be as easy as possible. And we do want things to be familiar. You know, you mentioned editors, and, you know, a lot of the cool new things we can do now in Visual Studio Code. And, you know, look, it's got, it's got AI now writing our code for us. It's got these amazing new things, new possibilities we can do. This is so amazing. Oh, wow, what you can do with the modern editors. And, you know, we had the Eclipse generation or whatever else. There's a bunch of people out there that are like, no fucking way I'm using Emacs. Like and they're gonna, sorry, excuse my language. They're gonna, what, you know, we can, I'm sorry, everyone, I'm sorry. But, you know, like, or, you know, BI, like, this is what I'm using, and I'm going to use this for everything. And the fact that, you know, that's something I think that where you've got to meet the developer where they are. And if you want them to change how they do things, you've got to build those automations in such a way that they can call them in a way they're comfortable. I think one of the interesting things with the editor GitHub thing is you can begin to do sort of, you know, perhaps GitOps is a place to instantiate some of the guardrails. You know, GitHub, we can begin to apply some policy through there. So I think that basically, from my perspective, yeah, we're how do we make, you know, lazy people do the right thing? And that's about, you know, developer experience. That's about really thinking through what it means. And if, you know, so if it's security, like if it comes, like GitHub, we had this mentioned earlier, you don't want your secrets in public repos. That is bad. So if GitHub comes to you and says, hello, we found this, it looks like a secret, you should probably get rid of it now, and you could just press a button and it's done, that's fantastic. So I think that yeah, go to the editor, go to Git, you know, make things easy for people, and then we're going to get better results.
Yeah, I just kind of like, just to kind of sum up in terms of the shifting left, it's like, I think we've been doing this for a while. We've been doing this with test-driven development, which is like, let's get developers into doing testing. And I think, you know, we've been talking in the chat about what do we mean about, you know, security, owning security and all that. It's, again, it's the visibility and the feedback loops. And I think that what we're talking about here and the original question of like being able to see in your IDE and seeing the kind of the, you know, the metrics and the data, what's going on in production, to me, that's like the ultimate, it's like the final frontier of of shifting left is that?
Excellent. So we're totally out of time. Since there was not a lot of Q&A in the session, I allowed it kind of to run over time. We just have 1 minute left. At the end of this discussion, I want to thank everybody who joined us from the attendees. Thank you very much. Thank you for the very live chat that we had here. It was so awesome doing all of those messages. There were over 100 messages in the chat during the discussion. That's always awesome. Thank you very much to the amazing panelists, Baruch, Kief, James, Barry. Thank you for hopping on this call with us. I think we just kind of have to close right now, but I just want to mention two important things at the end. First of all, sorry about that, this recording will be sent to you at the end of this session. Don't worry, you will get an email back. And in addition, if you haven't seen that already, lightrun.com/free, our own developer observability platform where I work, the thing that is the epitome, in our opinion, of shifting left. I hope you enjoyed this discussion, and I hope you come to the next sessions as well. Have a great rest of your day wherever you are in the world, and thank you very much. Bye-bye, everyone.